Welcome to the exam preparation for SC-300, Microsoft Identity and Access Administrator. My name is Peter de Tender. I'm a lead Microsoft technical trainer here at Microsoft. This video series will guide you through the essential strategies for taking the SC-300 exam. Our focus is on exam strategy and preparation, so we're not teaching technical concepts. We will cover the objectives, best practices, tips and tricks, and exam key points. This video will also include a lot of visual information for reference. Remember, you can pause the video at any time to review the content. This exam is designed for those who have hands-on experience using Microsoft Entra ID and Microsoft Cloud capabilities, involving implementing and managing user identities, authenticating access management, and governance. You may also take the optional SC-900 Security Fundamentals training as a good preparation. After receiving the fundamentals certification, you may have taken the official Microsoft training, either self-paced online or instructor-led training. Then comes this video series, the official exam prep. This set of videos is meant to help prepare you to take the exam by covering what topics may be covered and what resources you can use to study. Your path through becoming an Identity and Access Administrator Associate involves several steps. This video series is your comprehensive guide to exam preparation, covering essential topics and providing valuable study resources. Be sure to also make use of labs, study guides, practice tests, and focus on the skills highlighted during the exam prep course to ensure you are thoroughly prepared. Once you feel confident in your understanding of the content, it's time to take the exam. So with that, let's get started. This exam prep video series will help you with three key objectives. Identify what will be covered on the exam, gain insights on preparing for the exam, and determine which concepts to prioritize or revisit for further study. Now keep in mind, this series is not a replacement for official Microsoft training or hands-on experience. While it will guide you on what to expect in the exam, it won't teach the actual topics in detail. Use it to spot any knowledge gaps and focus your time and resources accordingly. In this series, each episode will cover one of the four groups in the objective domain. For SC-300, these groups are implementing and managing user identities, implement authentication and access management, plan and implement workload identities, and last, plan and automate identity governance. Each group has a specific weight, indicating the percentage of questions that will come from each area. Currently, Episode 2 and 4 are the most heavily weighted sections, so you may consider focusing more of your study time for those ones. However, to pass the exam, you need to be familiar with all skills in all groups. Let's dive into the content of Episode 1, which focuses on implementing and managing user identities. In this specific episode, we will cover how to configure and manage a Microsoft Entra tenant, creating, configuring, and manage Microsoft Entra identities, implement and manage identities for external users and tenants, and then last, implement and manage hybrid identity. Here is a list of all the different skills you may be tested on. Now, these are sometimes referred to as may include, meaning they may or may not be on your exam. This list isn't exhaustive, and while we won't be covering every skill in this video, be sure you can perform these skills before taking the exam. I would suggest to pause this video, grab a screenshot of this slide, and use it as an overview for your studying journey. One of the first technical topics to understand is what exactly Entra roles are, as well as when and how to use them. Know that external as well as internal resources can access Entra ID. Users can be IT admins, application developers, or Microsoft Cloud App subscribers. Be able to summarize the key Entra ID roles and their usage. Also, make sure you understand the core difference between Azure roles and Entra ID roles. And then also, keep in mind that although global admin is an available role that can do pretty much everything, it is not at all recommended for security purposes. So make sure you always use task-specific roles, which on the exam might refer as the role having the least amount of privilege for the described task. Next, let's have a look at what administrative units allow. Administrative units segment parts of your Entra ID tenant for independent administration. For instance, within a tenant of, let's say, 2,000 users, an admin unit might contain only 50 users with specific responsibilities. This segregation applies to applications, groups, and other resources. Admins possess full control within their designated admin unit, but they lack rights in the broader Entra tenant. While it's not a replacement for the previously discussed roles, they're nicely working together. I can only recommend you looking into the details on how the delegation scenarios work, along with the importance of granting access to users by using the following concepts: restricting who can register applications and manage them, assigning one or more owners to an application, and then also assigning a built-in administrative role that grants access to manage configuration in Microsoft Entra ID for all those applications. And then last, creating a custom role, defining specific permissions, and obviously assigning them. An example of an administrative unit scenario is a business unit manager, providing access to developers to work on a business-specific application running in, for example, a dev and test environment. Another Entra ID feature to highlight is company branding, together with tenant properties. While you might think of company branding as a marketing feature, in the end it allows you to customize the look and feel of the Entra ID sign-in page. I always position it as a security feature to our customers. If you customize the logon experience in such a particular way, users will get accustomed to it and will notice immediately when they end up on a phishing page, which looks quite identical but not yet different. While obvious, keep an eye on the overall tenant properties as well, especially the different contact options and related information. After configuring the tenant properties and branding, you will focus on user and group management. Users can end up in your tenant directory in a couple of different ways. Cloud identities, which exist only in Entra ID. You might have directory synchronized identities coming from an on-prem Active Directory and domain. Or you might have guest users, which are external identities, and you invite them into your tenant. When allocating permissions or granting users access to applications, always consider using group scoping for this, instead of assigning individual users. And make sure you understand the difference between security groups and Microsoft 365 groups. User objects can have additional custom security attributes. Custom security attributes allow organizations to define specific security-related properties for users, groups, or devices. For instance, a company might create a custom attribute called access level to categorize users based on their access permissions. This attribute can have values like high, medium, low, and by assigning these values to users, the company can implement more granular access control policies. For example, users with high access level might have permissions to access sensitive data, while those with low access level might only have access to basic information. This helps in tailoring security measures to meet specific organizational needs and enhances overall security management using Microsoft Entra ID. Managing Entra ID objects is easy from the Entra ID portal, also known as the Entra Admin Center, and even from the Microsoft 365 portal for most common settings. But instead of doing ClickUps, which is time intensive, error prone, and just not fun to do, make sure you're all familiar with the basics of automation of all this, using PowerShell, using Microsoft Graph modules particularly, as well as using the Azure CLI command line interface, which offers Entra ID specific commandlets, which are in line with any other Azure resource CLI. Positioning Entra ID objects, such as users, groups, and devices, would not be complete if not mentioning the licensing aspects of it as well. Following the previously mentioned guideline, try to assign your licenses based on groups and group membership instead of individual members. Provisioning and deprovisioning of licenses are common tasks you should be familiar with for the exam. And, while not explicitly mentioned on this slide, having a good understanding of the different Entra ID license flavors, think of P1, P2, governance license, is definitely beneficial for the exam. We already briefly talked about guest users. Now, these are external users which got explicitly invited into your tenant. This is where Entra ID B2B guest invite settings are crucial to understand. Remember that in cross-tenant access, B2B collaboration is allowed by default, but direct connection is restricted. You have inbound and outbound restrictions, as well as tenant-level restrictions you can define. This brings me to the actual technical slide on how this external users invitation process actually works. Guest users can be invited individually or using bulk invite, using a CSV or Excel file. Once an invited guest becomes an external user identity object in your tenant, you can assign roles and permissions in the same way as you would for internal users. Keep in mind that guest users also might require a license to be assigned, depending on what Entra features they need as a guest user, or what applications they need access to. Another common scenario we see is cross-tenant synchronization. Especially with enterprise-sized environments, although it's not exclusive to larger enterprises. Instead of managing identities in different tenants, establishing a sync between them takes away some or all of the administrative overhead. Some of the core features of the synchronization is assisting with the object provisioning across tenants, as well as obviously removing them when needed. Apart from explicitly inviting external users into your tenant, you could also look into federation, such as SAML or WSFED. Important to remind you is that the authentication is not changing for already invited guests. If guests redeemed their invitation before federation got put in place and only later on get switched to Entra ID authentication, those guest users will keep using their federated SAML or WSFED. Synchronizing users across tenants, usually from on-prem Active Directory tenants and domains into Entra ID tenant, is done using Entra Connect and Cloud Sync as the tooling. Entra Connect requires the installation of a specific tool into your on-prem Active Directory environment, where Cloud Sync relies on the cloud provisioning agent, which is more lightweight and simplifies the process of synchronization. Up till now, we mainly touched on the Entra ID objects aspect, but didn't really talk much about the authentication part. Entra ID provides 3 different ways to set up authentication: password hash sync, pass-through authentication, and federation. Password hash sync is the easiest to implement, and it keeps the password hash in sync between on-prem and cloud. With pass-through authentication or PTA, your password hash is not stored in Entra ID, but the authentication validation occurs between Entra and your on-premises running identity servers. Federation is where your cloud authentication request gets sent along to your on-prem Active Directory who will be used to authenticate users. For the exam, you need to understand the architecture of each solution, the use cases and benefits of each, as well as how to establish seamless sign-on. I remember setting up ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, as the main authentication solution in the early days of Azure Active Directory and hybrid Microsoft 365 and Azure. While nothing wrong in using it, Microsoft has been encouraging customers to consider migrating away from ADFS to other Entra ID provided authentication, like the mentioned password hash sync or pass-through authentication. Consider this slide here as a reminder for you to understand the implications of such a migration, as well as what the high-level steps are in the process. We're close to the end of this first objective domain, but allow me to emphasize there's even more you could be tested on at the exam, apart from the detailed scope I presented. Part of your Entra ID sync we discussed should also include validating Connect Health. Another aspect is understanding the interaction between Entra ID and Microsoft 365 without going too deep into Microsoft 365 itself. Remember, this is an identity and access focused exam. It's not a Microsoft 365 specific one. And last, again, not expecting you to have deep technical expertise, but make sure you make yourself familiar with Entra ID device management, as well as the difference between Entra ID domain joined or registered and the like. This brings us to the end of this first functional group, in which you learned about the first skills measured, implementing managing user identities, with a more detailed overview of how to configure and manage Entra tenants, how to create, configure, and manage Entra ID objects. Next, we talked about how to implement external users and tenants, and then closing with several hybrid identity-specific information. Remember, this group accounts for 20 to 25% of the exam, so keep that in mind when preparing for the exam. Thank you for watching episode 1 on configuring and managing a Microsoft Entra tenant. Be sure to join us for episode 2, where we cover implementing authentication and access management. See you again soon.